I, 22 need some perspective on a family situation that is completely blown up. This is a long story, but I need to provide context to explain how things got to this point. I grew up in a middle-class family with my older brother Brian, 25 and our parents. We lived in a decent neighborhood and my parents both worked hard to provide for us. What made our household different was that my grandfather lived with us since I was 5 years old. From the beginning, there was a clear difference in how my parents treated Brian and me. Brian was their golden child, their firstborn who could do no wrong. Every small achievement of his was celebrated like he had won an Olympic medal. When he got B grades, my parents would take him out for dinner to celebrate. When I got straight A's, they would just say good job and move on. My grandfather was the only one who saw through this dynamic. He was a retired business owner who had built everything from scratch and valued hard work above everything else. He spent equal time with both of us, teaching us about life, money, and the importance of integrity. While my parents constantly praised Brian's mediocre efforts, my grandfather was the one who encouraged me to push myself and achieve more. The favoritism became more obvious as we entered high school. If both of us got into trouble, somehow I was blamed for being a bad influence on Brian, despite being the younger one. When we both joined the school basketball team, my parents attended every game Brian played but always had excuses when it was my turn. My grandfather never missed a single game for either of us. Brian started showing concerning behaviors in high school. He would skip classes, but my parents always believed his excuses. He started asking for more pocket money than usual, claiming it was for school projects or team activities. My grandfather questioned this, but my parents shut him down, saying he was being too hard on Brian. I later found out Brian was using the money for online gambling, but when I tried to tell my parents, they accused me of being jealous of my brother. My grandfather had always been successful in his business ventures, and he wanted to ensure both his grandsons had a good start in life. 3 years ago, when his health started declining, he set up trust funds for both Brian and me. The money was meant to help us establish ourselves after graduation, either for higher education or starting a legitimate business. My parents were named trustees until we turned 21. Before setting up the trusts, my grandfather sat down with each of us separately. He told me he was proud of how I handled myself despite the obvious favoritism at home. With Brian, he had a long discussion about responsibility and making something of himself. A week after setting up the trusts, my grandfather had a severe heart attack and passed away. His death hit me hard because I lost the only person who truly saw me for who I was. After grandfather's death, Brian's behavior got worse. He barely graduated high school and attempted college only because my parents pressured him. He dropped out after one semester, claiming college wasn't for him. Meanwhile, I focused on my studies, participated in academic competitions, and got accepted into a good university. I wanted to make my grandfather proud. Things took a strange turn last year when Brian started dating Amelia, 24. She came from a wealthy background and had expensive tastes. Suddenly, Brian was wearing designer clothes, eating at high-end restaurants, and taking weekend trips. This was strange because he hadn't held a steady job since dropping out of college. When I asked my parents about it, they were vague and said Brian had some business ventures going on. I started noticing things around the house. Credit card statements showing massive purchases at luxury stores. Receipts from expensive restaurants. Casino charge slips in Brian's jacket when I was doing laundry. I even overheard arguments between Brian and someone on the phone about paying back money. But every time I tried to bring this up with my parents, they shut me down. Last week, I turned 22 and decided it was time to access my trust fund. I wanted to pursue my master's degree, and the money would help cover my expenses. When I brought this up with my parents, their reaction was unexpected. They got quiet, exchanged nervous looks, and asked me to sit down for a serious discussion. That's when they dropped the bombshell. They had been using money from both trust funds to help Brian because he was going through a rough patch. When I asked how much was left, they admitted they had used almost all of it, including my share. Their justification? Brian needed it more because he was planning to start a business. They said I could easily get scholarships for my studies, but Brian had no other options to make something of himself. I was stunned. Not just because they had used my money without my permission, but because I knew there was no business plan. Brian was burning through cash trying to maintain his lifestyle with Amelia. I had collected evidence over months, credit card statements, gambling receipts, text messages I had seen pop up on his phone about owing money to people. Yesterday, my parents organized a family dinner and invited our aunts and uncles. They said it was to discuss Brian's business plan, but I knew they were trying to pressure me into formally agreeing to let Brian use my share of the inheritance. During dinner, Brian started talking about his amazing business idea, some vague plan about an online marketplace that made absolutely no sense. Our relatives were eating it up, praising his entrepreneurial spirit while giving me disappointed looks for not supporting my brother. That's when I lost it. I went to my room and brought down the folder where I had been collecting evidence. I showed everyone the credit card statements revealing purchases at luxury stores and high-end restaurants. I displayed the gambling receipts I had found. I even had screenshots of texts from Amelia to Brian demanding expensive gifts and threatening to leave him if he didn't maintain their lifestyle. The dining room exploded into chaos. Brian jumped up and started yelling that I had no right to go through his things. My parents were more outraged at me for exposing Brian than at him for lying about everything. They said I had betrayed family trust and should be ashamed of myself. Our relatives were split. Some were appalled at Brian's behavior, while others said I should have handled this privately instead of humiliating my brother. My parents gave me an ultimatum: either apologize to Brian and agree to let him use my share of the inheritance, or leave their house. Before walking out, I told them that grandfather would be disappointed in how they had betrayed his wishes and failed to see Brian's manipulation. Now I'm staying with my best friend and trying to figure out my next steps. My phone is constantly buzzing with messages from family members, some offering support, others calling me selfish and heartless. Brian has been posting on social media about how I betrayed him out of jealousy. My parents haven't reached out except to demand I return home and apologize. Ida for exposing Brian and refusing to give up my inheritance? Update 1. First, I want to thank everyone for their supportive comments and helpful advice. The past 2 weeks have been a roller coaster, and I have a lot to share about what's happened since my last post. Following many of your suggestions, my first step was to contact a lawyer who specializes in trust law. I had to use most of my savings for the initial consultation, but it was worth every penny. The lawyer reviewed my grandfather's trust documents and confirmed what many of you suspected: my parents had no legal right to use my share of the trust fund for Brian. The terms were incredibly specific, something I hadn't known before. The money could only be used for education or starting a legitimate business, with proper documentation and business plans that had to be approved by a financial advisor. The lawyer also discovered something interesting. My grandfather had included a clause that required my parents, as trustees, to provide annual accounting of how the money was being spent. They never did this. When I mentioned this to my aunt, mom's sister, she revealed that my grandfather had always been worried about my parents' tendency to enable Brian's behavior, which explained the strict conditions in the trust. After the legal consultation, I knew I couldn't continue staying at my friend's place indefinitely. I found a small apartment and used my remaining savings for the security deposit. When I went back to my parents' house to pack my remaining belongings, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While cleaning out my desk drawer, I found a stack of papers that had gotten mixed up with my old school documents. These weren't just any papers, they were loan applications and credit agreements with my parents' names on them. At first, I thought they were legitimate documents, but then I noticed inconsistencies in the signatures. Brian had apparently taken out several high-interest loans using our parents as guarantors, forging their signatures on the documents. The amounts were staggering: multiple loans from different lenders, totaling over $50,000. I remembered how my parents had been complaining about receiving strange calls from unknown numbers, which now made sense. They were probably debt collectors trying to reach them about these loans. I was torn about what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to keep it to myself out of spite, but I knew that would make me no better than Brian. So, I made copies of everything and drove to my parents' house. When I showed them the documents, the color drained from their faces. My mom actually had to sit down, she was so shocked. That's when the truth started coming out. They called Brian home immediately, and for the first time, I saw my brother break down completely. He confessed everything. He had been borrowing money from multiple sources to keep up with Amelia's expensive tastes and cover his gambling debts. He had convinced himself he could pay everything back once his business took off. When one loan wasn't enough, he took out another, creating a vicious cycle of debt. The final blow came when my mother called Amelia's parents to discuss the situation. That's when we learned that Amelia had already moved on to dating someone else. She had apparently dumped Brian as soon as she discovered he wasn't as wealthy as he'd led her to believe. Brian hadn't told anyone about the breakup and was still spending money trying to win her back. My parents were devastated, but their reaction still frustrated me. Instead of holding Brian accountable, they begged me to keep quiet about the forged documents. They offered to take out a mortgage on their house to repay my trust fund. They said we needed to handle this as a family to protect Brian's future. I refused. Not because I didn't care about them, but because I could see this pattern continuing if someone didn't take a stand. I told them I was moving forward with legal action to recover my trust fund money. My mom cried, my dad shouted, but I stood firm. That's when things got ugly. Brian showed up at my new apartment late one night, clearly drunk. He alternated between crying about how sorry he was and threatening to ruin my life if I didn't withdraw the legal complaint. He said he knew things about me that would make my parents disown me, complete lies, but he was desperate. Thankfully, I had the presence of mind to record everything on my phone. The next day, I used the recording to get a restraining order against him. The family has split into two camps now. Some relatives, mainly the older generation, are taking Brian's side. They say I'm heartless for not helping family and that grandfather would be ashamed of me for taking legal action against my own parents. But others, including my grandfather's old friend who was also his lawyer, are supporting me. The lawyer friend sent me a letter revealing that my grandfather had suspected something like this might happen. He had seen warning signs in Brian's behavior years ago, which was why he had set up the trust with such strict conditions. I'm moving forward with the legal proceedings, even though it's breaking my heart to do this to my family. But every time I doubt myself, I remember my grandfather's words about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I've realized that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their destructive behavior, even if they hate you for it. Update 2: The situation has evolved in ways I never expected. What started as a family dispute over inheritance has uncovered a web of lies and criminal activity that honestly terrifies me. During the legal proceedings for recovering my trust fund, my lawyer requested a detailed audit of all financial transactions related to both trust funds. That's when we discovered that Brian's problems went far beyond gambling and overspending. The bank statements showed a pattern of large deposits and withdrawals that made no sense. My lawyer brought in a forensic accountant who specialized in fraud detection. It turns out Brian had gotten involved with a group of people who were using his desperation to their advantage. They had approached him at a casino when he was down on his luck and offered him what seemed like an easy way to make money. They would deposit large sums into accounts he opened, and he would withdraw the money in smaller amounts, keeping a percentage for himself. He thought he was helping them avoid taxes, but in reality, they were using him to launder money from illegal activities. When confronted with this evidence, my parents finally broke down and revealed their own secrets. They had known about Brian's gambling problem since he was in high school. They found betting slips in his room when he was 16 but decided to handle it quietly to protect his reputation. Instead of getting him help, they covered up his losses, thinking he would grow out of it. They admitted to paying off his gambling debts multiple times over the years, first from their savings, then by taking out loans, and finally by dipping into the trust funds. They showed me a box full of IOUs from Brian, dating back years. Each time, he had promised it was the last time, that he would change. Each time, they believed him. The most surprising revelation came from an unexpected source. Amelia contacted me through LinkedIn, saying she wanted to clear her conscience. We met at a coffee shop, and she brought along a folder of evidence. She admitted that she was initially part of the same group that had ensnared Brian in their money laundering scheme. Her role was to find vulnerable targets from wealthy families, people who were desperate for money and validation. But according to Amelia, something unexpected happened. She actually developed feelings for Brian and tried to get him to stop gambling and cut ties with the group. When he refused, choosing the easy money over her warnings, she left him. She provided screenshots of their conversations where she had tried to convince him to get help, along with details about the group's operations. I took all this information to my lawyer, who immediately contacted the authorities. The police are now investigating the money laundering operation, and my parents are facing serious legal scrutiny for their mismanagement of the trust funds. They could potentially face criminal charges for their role in covering up the illegal activities, even though they claim they didn't know about the money laundering. Brian has finally been forced to confront his demons. When the police showed up at our parents' house with a search warrant, he had a complete breakdown. He's now cooperating with the authorities and has agreed to enter a treatment program for his gambling addiction. The prosecutor has indicated that his cooperation might earn him some leniency, but he's still likely to face consequences for his role in the money laundering scheme. Some family members have suggested that I withdraw my complaints to protect everyone from legal consequences. They argue that Brian is finally getting help, and pursuing legal action will only tear the family apart further. But I can't do that. The investigation has revealed that other families have been victimized by this group, and the authorities believe Brian's testimony could help bring down the entire operation. My parents are desperately trying to salvage what they can. They've hired their own lawyer and are attempting to negotiate a settlement for the trust fund money. But their actions have consequences beyond just the financial aspect. The bank has frozen their accounts pending the investigation, and they might lose their house if they're found to have knowingly facilitated money laundering through the trust fund accounts. I never wanted any of this to happen. I just wanted my inheritance to use for my education, as my grandfather intended. Now I'm watching my family fall apart, and part of me feels guilty for setting these events in motion. But another part remembers what my grandfather always said about sunlight being the best disinfectant. Maybe this needed to happen for any real healing to begin. Update 3: After months of legal battles and family drama, things have finally reached a resolution, though not the one anyone expected. The court proceedings concluded last week, and I wanted to share the final chapter of this story. The judge's ruling was clear: my parents were ordered to repay my entire trust fund share plus interest. To comply with the order, they had to sell their vacation home in the mountains, the one we used to visit every summer when Brian and I were kids. It was painful watching a piece of our family history being sold, but as my lawyer pointed out, they brought this on themselves. Brian's situation has taken several turns. He completed the initial phase of his recovery program and has started working at an entry-level job at a local warehouse. The prosecutor, considering his cooperation in the money laundering investigation, offered him a plea deal with no jail time but 5 years of probation and mandatory addiction counseling. He took the deal. Last week, Brian sent me a lengthy email. He wrote about how he finally understands the damage he's caused, not just to himself but to everyone around him. He apologized for years of manipulation and for taking advantage of our parents' blind love. He even acknowledged how unfairly I was treated growing up. While part of me appreciates his honesty, I'm not ready to forgive him yet. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal quickly. My parents' apology came with strings attached. They admitted they should have treated us equally and addressed Brian's problems years ago instead of enabling him. But they also wanted me to help them financially since they're struggling after selling the vacation home. They suggested I could drop the interest payment requirement from the court order and give Brian some money to help him get back on his feet. I refused. Sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their actions. The investigation into the money laundering group is ongoing. Amelia has turned state's witness and is helping the authorities track down other victims. She tried to contact me again, wanting to explain more about how she got involved in the scheme, but I blocked her number. Some chapters are better left closed. I've been working with my grandfather's old lawyer to ensure the recovered trust fund money is properly managed this time. I start my master's program next semester, just as my grandfather wanted. The lawyer shared something interesting. Apparently, my grandfather had set up a separate small trust that would only become accessible if the main trust was mismanaged. He really did think of everything. Recently, my cousin forwarded me a diary belonging to my grandfather that she found while cleaning her attic. Reading it has been both comforting and painful. He wrote extensively about his concerns regarding Brian's behavior and my parents' blindness to it. There were several entries about how he hoped the trust fund conditions would force everyone to finally confront these issues. He also wrote about his pride in my resilience and his hopes for my future. I've maintained my decision to stay no contact with my family for now. Some relatives say I'm being too harsh, that family should stick together through hard times. But I've realized that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is step away. My grandfather wrote in his diary, "Standing alone is better than standing with people who hurt you." The money's been transferred to my new account, and I've moved to a different city to start my master's program. Sometimes I drive past our old vacation home and remember the good times, before money and lies tore everything apart. But then I remember my grandfather's words about building a life on truth rather than comfortable lies, and I know I made the right choice. Looking back on everything that's happened, I realized this was never really about the money. It was about truth, responsibility, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything you thought you needed. My grandfather understood that. I wish it hadn't taken all this for me to understand it too.